My name is Clara, I'm 29 years old, and my sister's brand new husband just introduced me to his entire family as her weird cousin. He said it with a smug little chuckle, a throwaway line designed to paint me as a quirky, insignificant footnote in my own sister's life. He wanted to make me invisible. He had no idea that his own father, the titan of industry whose approval he so desperately craved, was about to hear my last name and expose him as a fool in front of everyone. The party was at the Harrison estate, a place that didn't just whisper money, it screamed it from the hand-carved marble rooftops. Chandeliers dripped from the ceilings like frozen waterfalls, and waiters in crisp white jackets floated through the crowd with trays of champagne and impossibly tiny, expensive-looking appetizers. I felt like I was in a movie, and I was definitely just an extra. I had spent a week's salary on a simple, elegant navy dress, hoping to look sophisticated, hoping to make a good impression, not for myself, but for my sister, Melissa. This was her new world, and for her sake, I wanted to fit in. But from the moment I arrived, it was clear that wasn't part of the plan. My sister, Melissa, greeted me at the door with a hug that felt more like a checklist item being ticked off. "Clara, you made it. Try not to look so overwhelmed," she'd whispered, her eyes darting over my shoulder to see if anyone important was watching. Her husband, Mark, simply gave me a curt nod, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. They were a unit, a polished, perfect couple, and I was the awkward, out-of-place accessory they were obligated to have. Have you ever been deliberately belittled by someone who was supposed to be family? It's a uniquely painful feeling, like being told you don't belong in your own life. Share your story in the comments below, because speaking up is the first step to taking your power back. And make sure you subscribe, because you won't want to miss how this night of humiliation turned into my greatest victory. For about an hour, I drifted. I tried to make small talk, but every conversation felt like an interview for a club I hadn't applied to. Then I saw Mark striding towards me, a look of performative charm on his face. He was with an older, imposing couple, clearly his parents. This was it, the big moment. My stomach twisted. I straightened my dress and put on my best, most pleasant smile. "Mom, Dad," Mark said, his voice booming with false warmth. "I'd like you to finally meet someone from Melissa's side of the family." He draped an arm over my shoulder, a gesture that felt less like an embrace and more like a restraint. His parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harrison, looked at me with polite, disinterested curiosity. They were waiting for a name, a connection, something to place me in their social hierarchy. And that's when Mark delivered the blow. He leaned in, a conspiratorial grin on his face, and said, "This is her weird cousin, Clara, the artistic one." He didn't even use my last name. Cousin, not sister. He had demoted me, erased our actual relationship to make me seem more distant, less important. Weird, artistic. The words were coded, meant to translate to unemployed, unserious, not one of us. I saw a flicker of a smirk on Melissa's face from across the room as she watched. She was in on it. The humiliation was a hot flash that spread from my neck to my cheeks. I just stood there, speechless, as the label he'd just slapped on me hung in the air, defining me in front of the two people whose opinion mattered most in his world. To understand the sting of that moment, you have to understand that this wasn't a new script. It was just a performance on a much grander stage. For my entire life, I have been the supporting character in the Melissa show. Growing up, she was the beautiful, charismatic one, the social butterfly who collected friends like charms on a bracelet. I was the quiet one, the studious one, the one who lived more inside my head and on my computer screen than in the sunlit world she occupied. Our parents, bless their hearts, leaned into these roles hard. Melissa was praised for her popularity. I was praised for my grades. It created a chasm between us. Her currency was social status, mine was achievement, and in her world, only her currency had any real value. When she met Mark, it was like she'd found her male counterpart. He was handsome, came from old money, and had the kind of casual arrogance that the world mistakes for confidence. They saw my life not as different, but as lesser. I tried to explain my work to them once. I'm a lead digital architect and strategist. I don't just make things pretty. I design the entire user experience for complex software systems. I build the invisible frameworks that make technology feel intuitive and human. I lead a team. My work is anonymous by contract, but my signature style, under my professional pseudonym, C. Vance, has won industry awards. When I told them this, over a strained family dinner, Mark had chuckled. So, you draw on a computer for a living? Must be nice to have a hobby that pays the bills. Melissa just smiled that tight, condescending smile of hers and said, "Oh, leave her alone, Mark. We can't all be in high finance." They reduced my passion, my expertise, my entire career into a child's pastime. They did it consistently, relentlessly. Every family gathering involved a backhanded comment about my little projects or a pointed question about when I was going to get a real job. They never asked to see my portfolio. They never acknowledged the articles written about my projects in tech journals. To them, my success was inconvenient. It didn't fit the narrative they had written for me, the narrative of the weird, awkward sister who needed Melissa's shining light to even be seen. Last Christmas was a prime example. I had just led my team to launch a revolutionary new interface for a major logistics company, a project that had been a grueling, year-long effort. The day of the launch, Melissa called. Not to congratulate me, though she knew it was happening. She called to tell me she had forgotten to mention that the family was changing our Christmas plans and would be at the Harrison's Country Club instead of at our parents' house. I had already booked a non-refundable flight. "Oh, Clara, I'm so sorry," she'd said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Things have just been so crazy with the wedding planning. My mind is a sieve." I knew it was a lie. It was a power play, a way to make me feel small and excluded on a day that should have been a triumph for me. It was her way of reminding me that her life, her wedding, her world was the main event, and mine was, at best, a forgotten side note. So as I stood there in that opulent ballroom, with Mark's heavy arm on my shoulder and his parents' pitying eyes on me, I understood. This wasn't just an insult. It was a branding exercise. He and Melissa were officially launching me in their new social circle with the label they had chosen for me. I wasn't Clara Vance, successful digital architect. I was Melissa's weird, artsy cousin, an amusing little charity case they kept around for color. They were boxing me in, defining me, ensuring no one would ever look at me and see anything but what they wanted them to see. I felt the heat in my cheeks, the familiar burn of injustice. But this time, something else was there too. A cold, quiet calm. They had pushed me one time too many. They had underestimated me one time too many. And they were doing it in front of the one person in the room who might actually understand the value of my work. The silence that followed Mark's introduction felt like a physical weight. Mrs. Harrison gave me a tight, polite smile, the kind you give to a server who has brought the wrong drink. She was already dismissing me. But Mr. Harrison, Arthur Harrison, the founder and CEO of Harrison Logistics, one of the biggest players in global shipping, didn't smile. He just tilted his head, his gaze sharp and analytical. He wasn't looking at me with pity. He was looking at me with scrutiny, like a puzzle he was trying to solve. I found my voice. It came out steadier than I felt. I gently removed Mark's arm from my shoulder, a small act of defiance that felt monumental. I extended my hand to his father. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Harrison. I'm Clara Vance, and I'm Melissa's sister, actually." I said my full name, Clara Vance. I put emphasis on the last name, the name I shared with Melissa, the name Mark had deliberately omitted. Mark's face tightened. He was about to make another snide remark. I could see it coiling behind his eyes. But he never got the chance. The moment the name Vance left my lips, Arthur Harrison's expression transformed. His eyes widened, first with surprise and then with dawning comprehension. A jolt of energy seemed to pass through him. "Vance?" he repeated, his voice a low boom that cut through the party chatter around us. He ignored my outstretched hand and instead took a step closer, his focus entirely on me, as if his wife and son had ceased to exist. "Clara Vance? Not C. Vance?" The air went still. My heart hammered against my ribs. C. Vance, my professional pseudonym. The name on the contracts, the byline on the industry awards, the signature on the designs that had been revolutionizing supply chain management software for the last 3 years. the name that Harrison Logistics had been trying to headhunt, aggressively, for the last 6 months. I could only nod, my throat suddenly dry. "Yes," I managed. "That's me." The shift in the room was instantaneous and seismic. It was like a switch had been flipped, and the entire power dynamic of the past 29 years had just been rewired. Arthur Harrison broke into a wide, genuine grin. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "My God," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked from me to his utterly bewildered son, and then back to me. You're the one I've been trying to hire. My team has been sending emails to your agent for months. We've been trying to get a meeting with Vance for half a year. We thought you were a man in his 50s working out of Silicon Valley." He finally took my hand, but not for a polite handshake. He clasped it with both of his grip firm and enthusiastic. "Your work on the Aero Freight platform? It's genius. Absolute genius. You streamlined their entire back end and increased their efficiency by 30%. I've had my top engineers studying your architecture. It's the most elegant systems design I've seen in a decade." I saw Mark's face. The smugness had vanished, replaced by a pale, slack-jawed shock. His mouth was slightly agape. He looked at me, then at his father, then back at me, as if he couldn't reconcile the two images, the weird cousin he had just dismissed, and the genius his powerful father was fawning over. Across the room, Melissa's smile was frozen on her face, a brittle mask of horror. She had just watched her carefully constructed narrative about me get blown to smithereens by the one man whose opinion she and her husband valued above all others. In that moment, something inside me broke free. It was years of accumulated hurt, of being minimized, of being made to feel small and apologetic for who I was. All of it crystallized into a single, sharp point of clarity. I was done. I was done being their footnote. I was done letting them write my story. The game hadn't just changed. I had just realized I was holding all the cards, and for the first time, I was ready to play my hand. The rest of that party was a blur of newfound respect and hushed whispers. Arthur Harrison didn't leave my side for nearly an hour. He introduced me to everyone, CEOs, board members, investors, not as his son's new sister-in-law, but as Vance, the architect he was determined to bring on board. I watched Mark and Melissa from the corner of my eye. They were trapped, forced to smile and nod as people came up to them, congratulating them on having such a brilliant person in their family. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a champagne flute. But I knew this was just the first move on the chessboard. The public revelation was one thing, securing my victory was another. I went home that night not with a sense of giddy triumph, but with a cold, clear purpose. For years, I had built complex systems for others. Now, I was going to build one for myself. The next morning, an email from Arthur Harrison was in my inbox, formally requesting a meeting. A week later, another one came from my own agent, forwarding a staggering preliminary offer from Harrison Logistics. It was more than a job. It was a position as Vice President of Digital Innovation, a role they were creating specifically for me. It came with a salary that dwarfed Mark's, a significant equity stake in the company, and complete creative control over their entire digital infrastructure overhaul. I didn't say yes. Not yet. This wasn't about the money or the title. It was about justice. I knew that accepting the offer immediately would be a win, but it wouldn't be the checkmate I was looking for. Mark and Melissa would simply spin it. They'd say they always knew I was talented, that they were just joking around, that they were the ones who had made the introduction to Arthur in the first place. They would try to ride my coattails all the way to the top. I couldn't let that happen. So, I began to prepare, silently. My first call was to my agent. I told her to counter the offer. I instructed her to be polite but firm, to lay out a list of non-negotiable terms. I wanted a bigger team. I wanted a dedicated research budget that answered to no one but me and Arthur. I wanted an ironclad clause in my contract that stipulated any and all public announcements or press releases about my hiring would be handled exclusively by my own PR firm, not Harrison's internal team. My agent was surprised by my aggression, but she recognized the strategy. I was establishing my power before I even walked in the door. Next, I did a deep dive into Harrison Logistics' corporate structure. I read every quarterly report from the last 5 years. I studied their board of directors, their major shareholders, their corporate bylaws. I discovered that Mark wasn't just a VP of finance. He was specifically in charge of the budget for tech acquisitions and innovation, the very department I would be heading. He would, in effect, be reporting to me on all budgetary matters related to my division. His professional fate would be inextricably tied to mine. I spent the next 2 weeks in intense, back-and-forth negotiations, all while maintaining complete radio silence with my family. Melissa called. I didn't answer. She texted, her messages growing more frantic. Clara, we need to talk. Mark feels terrible about what happened. Dad Harrison keeps asking about you. What should we tell him? I let every message go unanswered. Their panic was a quiet hum in the background of my real work. I was letting them sweat. I was letting them wonder what was happening in the world of C. Vance, a world they had just discovered they had no access to and no control over. The longer I remained silent, the more their powerlessness grew. This silent rise was intoxicating. It was the feeling of a system I had designed running perfectly, every cog and wheel turning exactly as I'd planned. The stage was almost set. All I needed was the perfect moment for the final confrontation. And I knew just when that would be. The annual Harrison Foundation Gala, the biggest philanthropic event of the year, where Arthur was scheduled to give the keynote address. The night of the Harrison Foundation Gala arrived. This time, I didn't choose a dress to blend in. I wore a striking architectural gown in emerald green, a color of power and rebirth. When I walked into the grand ballroom, it felt like my true debut. Heads turned. People who had ignored me at the last party now nodded in my direction with respect. I had accepted Arthur's final negotiated offer that very afternoon. My agent had timed the signing of the contract perfectly. I was now officially the VP of Digital Innovation at Harrison Logistics. But no one knew it yet. That was the ace up my sleeve. I found my family at the head table. My parents were there, looking flustered and proud. Melissa and Mark were a portrait of anxiety. They stood when I approached, their smiles brittle. Clara, you look amazing, Melissa said, her voice a little too high. Mark just mumbled a greeting, unable to meet my eyes. He looked like a man waiting for a verdict. I'm sorry I've been out of touch, I said, my voice cool and even. I've been weighing a significant career opportunity. Before they could respond, Arthur Harrison strode over, clapping me warmly on the shoulder. Clara, I'm so glad you're here. We have a lot to celebrate tonight. He winked at me, and I gave him a small, knowing smile. The trap was set. Dinner was an exercise in tension. My parents tried to make small talk, but Melissa and Mark were silent, picking at their food. They kept shooting glances between me and Arthur, trying to piece together the puzzle of my silence. Finally, the lights dimmed. It was time for Arthur's keynote speech. He took the stage to thunderous applause. He spoke about the future, about innovation, about the need for bold vision. Then, he shifted gears. The future of Harrison Logistics depends not just on ships and trucks, but on technology. For months, my team and I have been searching for a visionary leader to spearhead our digital transformation. We searched the globe for the best of the best. We were looking for a legend in the tech world, a person known only by the name C. Vance. A murmur went through the crowd. I could feel every eye at my table on me. Mark's face was ashen. Arthur continued, his voice resonating with passion. We made this person an offer, a significant one. We asked them to help us build the future, and for weeks, we waited for an answer. Tonight, I am thrilled to announce that this visionary has accepted. It is my profound honor to introduce the new Vice President of Digital Innovation for Harrison Logistics. He paused, letting the anticipation build. Melissa was gripping Mark's arm under the table, her knuckles white. They thought this was it. The moment Arthur would point to me and their social status would be secured forever. But before I bring her up, Arthur said, his eyes finding mine in the crowd, I want to share a small story. When I first met this brilliant individual, it was at a party at my own home, and my own son, he gestured towards a mortified Mark, introduced her to me as her weird cousin. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. It was quiet, but it was audible. The humiliation was no longer mine. It was a spotlight shining directly on Mark. He dismissed her, Arthur said, his voice now cold as steel. He and her sister, my new daughter-in-law, had spent years diminishing her accomplishments, labeling her as odd, belittling her career because it didn't fit their narrow definition of success. They tried to make a giant seem small. They had no idea that the weird cousin they were so ashamed of was the very person our multi-billion-dollar company was desperately trying to hire. He let the words hang in the air, a public indictment. He wasn't just telling a story, he was teaching a lesson. He looked directly at Mark and Melissa. Let this be a reminder to everyone. True value isn't about social status or who you know. It's about what you can do. It's about talent and vision and grit. Qualities my son and his wife failed to see in their own family. The silence was deafening. I looked at Melissa. Tears were welling in her eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated shame. Mark looked like he had been physically struck. His face was a mess of shock and humiliation. His father had just stripped him bare in front of the entire world that mattered to him. Then, Arthur Harrison smiled broadly. But she is bigger than their small-mindedness. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the future of Harrison Logistics, Ms. Clara Vance. The room erupted in applause. As I stood up, the sound washed over me. I walked towards the stage, not as Melissa's sister, not as a weird cousin, but as myself. I passed my sister and her husband. I didn't look at them. I didn't have to. I had taken back my narrative. I had won. And the best part? The game was just getting started. If watching this takedown gave you a sense of justice, hit that like button. Your support helps stories of empowerment like this one reach more people who need to hear them. The aftermath of that gala was a quiet earthquake. Melissa and Mark didn't just leave the party. They practically vanished. They slipped out a side door while I was still on stage, shaking hands with Arthur and accepting congratulations. The head table, once the epicenter of their social world, was left with 2 empty chairs, a testament to their public fall from grace. My parents stayed, caught between pride for me and shock over what had happened. For the first time, they saw the dynamic between me and my sister for what it truly was. Not a simple sibling rivalry, but a sustained campaign of belittlement that had finally imploded. The consequences for Mark were swift and brutal. The story of his humiliation, delivered by his own father, became the stuff of corporate legend. He was the man who couldn't see the diamond in his own house. At work, he was neutered. As I had discovered, his department was in charge of my division's budget. My first official act as VP was to submit a budget proposal so ambitious, so forward-thinking, that it made his previous allocations look like child's play. He had no choice but to approve it. Every meeting we had was a study in controlled misery for him. I was professional, direct, and completely impassive. I never mentioned the party. I never mentioned our family. I simply treated him like any other subordinate whose department served mine. The power dynamic had been inverted so completely, it was almost poetic. Within 3 months, he was quietly reassigned to a satellite office in another state, a move everyone knew was a corporate exile. Melissa tried to reach out. At first, it was a flood of tearful voicemails and desperate texts, filled with apologies that sounded more like excuses. She said she was intimidated by my intelligence, that she was jealous, that she let Mark's influence corrupt her. I didn't respond. The words were meaningless now. They were the frantic damage control of someone who had lost, not the genuine remorse of someone who understood the depth of the hurt they had caused. Her social standing, which was entirely tied to Mark's position and the Harrison name, crumbled. She was no longer the belle of the ball. She was the wife of the disgraced son. Their move out of state was the final nail in the coffin of the life she had prized above all else. My own life, in contrast, blossomed. I threw myself into my work at Harrison Logistics, and it was the most fulfilling professional experience I'd ever had. Arthur became more than a boss. He was a mentor. He respected my vision and gave me the resources and autonomy to execute it. We were building something incredible, and I was at the helm. I bought a beautiful loft downtown, a space that was all mine, filled with light and books and the quiet hum of my own success. I was no longer the weird, artistic one. I was just Clara, free. The freedom wasn't just financial or professional. It was an internal liberation. For so long, a part of my identity had been defined in opposition to Melissa and her world. I was the other sister. Now, that definition was gone. I wasn't reacting to them anymore. I was simply living. I was in control of my own story, my own image, my own value. The victory wasn't just in their defeat, but in my own ascension. I had stopped seeking their approval, and in the process, had found my own. The silence from their side of the world was no longer a punishment. It was peace. Looking back, it's funny when I think about it now, that label they tried to give me, the weird cousin. For years, I thought it was something I had to fix about myself, something to be ashamed of. I thought if I just worked harder, or was more outgoing, or dressed a certain way, I could finally fit into the picture they had framed for me. But I was never meant to fit into their picture. I was meant to draw my own. What this whole journey taught me is that people will only ever see you through the lens of their own limitations. My sister and her husband couldn't see my value because they only valued one thing: social currency. They couldn't understand my passion because their ambitions were shallow. They called me weird because my path was different from theirs, and that frightened them. My success wasn't the weapon that defeated them. My success was the shield that protected me. The real victory wasn't watching them fall. It was realizing I no longer cared if they were watching me rise. I never did reply to Melissa's messages, and it wasn't out of spite. It was out of self-preservation. Some relationships are built on a power imbalance, and when that balance shifts, the foundation crumbles. You can't rebuild on rubble. My relationship with my parents has been a slow process of healing. They are trying to understand the woman I've become, not the quiet daughter they thought they knew. They see me now, truly see me, and that's a start. So I want to leave you with this thought. What label has someone tried to put on you? What box have they tried to force you into? Remember this: your value is not up for debate. It is not determined by someone else's opinion, their jealousy, or their inability to see you clearly. Your worth is proven in your work, in your character, in the quiet integrity with which you build your own life. Let them have their labels. You just keep building. Thank you for watching. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own power. Your story matters.